So good afternoon, everybody. We're going to be talking about our team's first approach to file share and SharePoint migrations. So here, why don't I get my PowerPoint organized? We'll get to the next slide, and we'll start with intros for those of you that don't know me. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT, also an Office Apps and Services MVP. Contact details are on the slide here. Also the president of the local Toronto SharePoint users group. We will be publishing up copies of the slides as well as the recording, so you can grab all my details from there. Logan, why don't you go ahead on your side?
Sure. Myself, I'm Logan Guest. I'm our sales and marketing manager. So I get the opportunity to work with a lot of different clients on these sorts of migration projects. And I'm your point of contact if you have any questions following the webinar.
So a little background, if you're not familiar with Envision IT, we're focused on Microsoft 365. We've sort of evolved from a SharePoint partner to a Office 365 partner to a Microsoft 365 as Microsoft has continued to evolve in the cloud. And really, our go-to focus is modern workplace, records management, intranets, and extranets. We've been working with SharePoint since way back in 2001, so we've done lots of migrations, not just from other systems into SharePoint, but from different versions on premises into the cloud and such. We're going to talk through those different scenarios here today. So quick agenda of what we're going to cover off. We've called this a team's first approach to Microsoft 365 migrations. The reality is, with COVID and most knowledge industries working remotely for the last couple of years, if you're in the Microsoft stack, you've kind of gotten thrown into the deep end with Microsoft Teams, and that may have not propagated to the full degree of Microsoft's vision of how you use Teams. And what we want to ensure is, as you're looking to do migrations from a document management point of view, from a file share point of view, from an on-premises SharePoint into M365, that you're thinking about the decisions that you need to make from a Teams approach point of view. And that's really the first thing I'm going to be talking about. Then we'll get into the actual process of doing migrations. How do we do inventories? How do we plan? What does a modern information architecture look like? And then get into migration process and tools. We're going to be talking about a number of third-party tools that we use and sort of pros and cons and which fits where from that point of view. And then very important to this topic is adoption and change management. This is a change for organizations, a change in the way they work, the way they go to find their knowledge, their information, their documents. So making sure that the proper change management is in place, training, etc., is all part of the successful migration project. So let's start by just talking about types of migrations. File shares have been around for decades now, and still very much in use in a lot of organizations. There's often multiple different file shares that could represent departments within an organization, different projects, could be personal file shares. So that's obviously something that we're still dealing with and helping clients move off of those file shares and into Microsoft's vision of a modern workplace and cloud-based collaboration. And of course, there's SharePoint on premises, older versions, SharePoint 2010, 2013. We've done a number of 2010 migrations recently, since that is now end of support and no longer supported by Microsoft. And SharePoint 2013 is pretty close on the heels of that, fall of 2023, which is kind of less than a year and a half away. You need to be planning for that, is also coming off the support list from Microsoft's point of view. And really, there's less and less reason to continue running SharePoint on premises. There's often a high degree of customization there. That's probably the biggest barriers, and we'll talk about that. But there's a lot of advantage to moving away from that and moving into a cloud-based strategy. Then there's other like legacy records management systems, maybe you're using OpenText, FileNet, Content Manager. There's a long list of different vendors. Again, those may be on-premise, legacy architectures that again, from a modernization point of view, you just need to get off of those platforms. And then surprisingly, SharePoint Online itself is a migration source as well as a destination. Unfortunately, for the early adopters that got into the cloud early and kind of did the same things that we did on premises with deep sets of subsites and classic team sites and such, there's the opportunity now to modernize that, to say, hey, how do we flatten that out? How do we make it more in line with Microsoft's vision with Teams and do an online to online migration within the same tenant? Or sometimes we get approached where there's been an acquisition or a merger and there's a need to merge tenants together to say, hey, how do we get this content out of this tenant and in this other new tenant at the parent level or at the sub level, what have you from there. I just realized I'm still sharing my camera here. I'm going to just turn that off so it's not in the way from a presentation point of view. And then let's keep rolling through from that perspective. So the title is Teams First, and actually information architecture is an important part of that. It's a concept that we've talked about for many years. It's something that you know, we promoted back in the SharePoint 2007, 2010 days. That planning out what we call it the IA, the information architecture, looks like is really important to success of these kinds of projects, and it applies equally importantly in SharePoint Online and Microsoft Teams. And part of that is that Microsoft's kind of gone away from the deep sub-site structure. You know, people got used to folders within folders within folders in file shares, and they kind of did the same thing in SharePoint on-premises, where they'd have a top-level site, and then they create lots of sub-sites nested deeper and deeper within that, and then they have document libraries and folders deeper in that. And really, you know, the approach is that yes, you can do modern sub-sites, but they're not really recommended. You know, you want to have site collections and then what's called hub sites to group those together. And why that's important with Microsoft Teams is Teams drives that behavior. Every time you create a Microsoft team, you're creating a team site collection in SharePoint underneath that. And anytime you're working with files in the Files tab in Teams, that's where they're going. They're going into that team site. So even if you're not fully fleshed out in a Teams architecture yet, you know, maybe you're just using it for meetings and chats and such, you haven't gone to the point of having teams and channels and structure there, you really want to think about that and say, hey, you know, let's get ahead of that. If we're doing a migration into Microsoft 365, let's have that structure in place so that we're well set up and we don't have to do a cloud to cloud migration later as part of that. So if we look at what we call a classic information architecture versus a modern information architecture, on the left is that classic style where we've got, you know, a deep hierarchy of subsites through there. On the right, we can still have organization. We can have what's called hub sites to organize different groups of site collections together. So, you know, HR can have theirs, communications can have theirs, marketing can have theirs, and then can have different site collections underneath that. And often what we see is these site collections, you know, either start out as Microsoft Teams, or at some point in the future, they're going to be promoted to become a Microsoft team. So let's plan it accordingly so that that works smoothly and works well from that perspective. So what do we need to think about from a information architecture when we think of Teams First migrations? You know, the big questions that we pose to our clients is for your organization, what does a team actually represent? And teams can have channels within them, which is really a way to organize both files that you work on and conversations that you have. What does channels represent? You know, maybe you've got a team for a department and you've got channels for sub-departments or projects within that department. Maybe a team represents a client and a channel represents a project. That's actually what we've done at Envision IT. So when we went through our own sort of cloud-based migration, because we had migrated from SharePoint 2013 on-premise to BPOS early days and then Office 365. So we were one of those early adopters into the cloud. We always like to be ahead of our clients and figure out the pain and the resolution for that ahead of clients experiencing that. So when Teams was coming along, we had to do a whole re-architecture and planning of what our information architecture looked like. We decided, you know, we've got several hundred clients, so there's a fair number of clients there, but let's create a team for each client. And then we typically do multiple projects for individual clients. So we're going to create channels in Teams under each of those client teams for the projects that we're doing for them. And that gives us a place to organize the conversations that we have internally. We don't tend to use Teams externally just yet. We're waiting for shared channels or Teams Connect, which has been a long time coming from Microsoft to make it easy to bring external users in there. But we do use it extensively. In fact, we don't use email at all internally anymore. Everything is through Teams. And then everything related to those projects for those clients from a document point of view lives in those folders underneath those channels there. So that's sort of an example of how we've built out our Teams First information architecture. And it's not a one size fits all. You know, it's a consultative process we'll go through with you to understand your organization, the way that you work, the way that you organize, and help build out what that information architecture should look like. Now, beyond the teams and channels, though, you know, we've still got the concept of folders. You may use things like document sets, which are really folders on steroids with metadata attached to them, or metadata on the documents themselves. And Teams really encourages the use of folders. They were actually late in the game to support the full rich metadata from SharePoint. It was only probably going on 2 years ago now, but Teams was well in market before they started supporting rich metadata and views, but they do now. We often use document sets to simplify assigning the metadata. Basically, when you put documents into a document set, they inherit all the metadata of that document set. So it's an easy way to assign metadata, and you can always assign additional metadata at the document level. Not to say you can't use folders. Folders still make sense and can be used as part of that as well. So, that's all the process that you need to go through in terms of mapping out that information architecture. Now, the other important piece is Teams and Sites provisioning. This has been something close to my heart for a long time now. We've had what started as a SharePoint site provisioning solution that's evolved into a Teams provisioning solution for quite a number of years. It's probably going on 6 years or so ago now that we started working on this. And it's evolved. We've had lots of different clients help fund it along the way. We've open sourced out that solution, and it continues to evolve. It's available up on Git. We publish white papers and documentation around it. But not saying you have to use ours. What's really important is to say, hey, we've got some process, we've got some governance around the request process and the templating of teams and sites. And why this is important is, I'm like everybody else. I don't like rules. I don't like people telling me this is exactly how you need to work and you need to follow these rules. But there's more of a carrot approach that I like around this, which is to say, hey, rather than getting a blank slate, an empty team and a team site, what if you have a template that makes sense on what a project team looks like or what a client team looks like, and have that baked and ready to go. So when somebody requests one, it's built out in that structure. And there aren't hard and fast rules that say they have to follow that structure. But if you give something that makes sense to people, that's already laid out, and all they have to do is follow that pattern, they're very likely that they're going to follow that. Versus you give everybody a blank slate, you're going to get an infinite number of different ways of doing things. So this is important from a self-serve governance point of view. You don't want to lock it down and say, hey, everybody needs to go to IT every time they need a new team or a team site. But you do need some rules and some governance around that. And there's a number of third-party approaches that work really well around this as well. We've done a lot of projects with Orchestry, Vancouver-based company. They've got an awesome product for Teams governance that isn't just about the request and the provisioning. It's around the full life cycle. Like, when should a team get shut down and how does it get archived, and that whole side of it as well. Valo Teamwork, been around for a while. We've been a Valo partner for quite a while. They've really caught up to Orchestry. I think they got their butt kicked a little bit by Orchestry when they first came to market, but they've closed that gap and they've got a nice product from a teamwork point of view. Bind Tuning is a Portuguese company I'm not as familiar with. We're just starting to get into that and get a better understanding, but it looks quite promising there as well. So net is, you don't even have to pick one of these. There's other vendors out there, but figure out your governance and how you're going to approach that and get some sort of process together as part of that. Why this is important is as you start to do your migration, you want to use the tool that you've selected as part of that migration process, because odds are, your source side, whether that's a file share, an on-premise SharePoint, even a classic SharePoint Online cloud-based solution, is not in the right architecture. So, get this in place, have workspace templates defined so that as you migrate across, the target sites are already pre-created in the modern structure and they're ready for the modern workplace. Now, just to go a little deeper on our open source side, we basically have it's called a SharePoint Framework web part. It's a web part you drop on your site that allows people to request a new team or to request a new site, and they can pick a template for that. You can build all sorts of rules to get about who gets to pick which templates and whether approvals are required for it to go forward. All that stuff can get built in through there. And then you've got a nice process to request it, apply the template, and make the person that requested it an owner so they can just self-serve from there, and away they go. They're off to the races.
Hey Peter, there's been a good chat message surrounding file permissions within channels where there's limitations on sharing, permissions with just members of that specific channel. An example is in a business team, there's a channel called HR, and they've not been able to lock down the file permissions in that channel to just members of that private channel. It's available to all members of that team. So I don't know if you can speak more to really just permissions at a channel level.
Yeah, in the way you've described it there, it doesn't really make sense, because the definition of a private channel is it's a subset of the members of the main team, and only that subset of people get to see the conversations, and that same subset of people are the only ones that get to see the documents in there. And in fact, I'm not really keen on what Microsoft did with private channels. Basically, when you create a private channel, it creates a whole new team site just for that channel, so it kind of separates it out, and that's how they manage the permissions on that. But it sounds like there's something else going on there. I'm not sure exactly. We could certainly take some time outside of the webinar to dig in and understand that. Just tweaking though on that is that you don't have to have the permissions in SharePoint in the team site match exactly with what's in the team. And we do this ourselves all the time. I mentioned earlier that we don't invite our clients into the teams, but we do invite them into the SharePoint team sites. And the reason we do that is today, if you invite somebody into your team for them to join into the conversations, they basically need to flip their team's client so that it's connected to your tenant and no longer connected to theirs, and then they lose all their activity notifications from their own tenant. It's really not a good way to work. And shared channels, which Microsoft announced 2 years ago but still hasn't got to market, really addresses that. But what we do instead is we continue to communicate through email with our clients, and we break the permissions inheritance in the SharePoint site so that we can give them access to a portion of the SharePoint site. We don't give it all of it. There's sort of a private area that we keep private internally at Envision IT, but they can then come in through that and view that. So coming back to the migration side, so as we're talking about primarily SharePoint Online migrations, it's really about how do we get our documents out of those legacy systems and into SharePoint Online. Just to recap what I've been talking about there, rethinking your information architecture, super important. This is your opportunity. You don't want to have to go through another migration a year from now just because you took your old information architecture and it didn't align with Teams, and now you're using Teams more and it doesn't fit and you've got to remigrate it all. Be forward thinking and get all that in place in advance. Even if you haven't fully embraced the full scope of what Teams is today, odds are you're going to go be using more of it in the future. It's a huge part of Microsoft's modern workplace strategy. There's a number of different migration tools we're going to talk about that can be used to manage the migration process. And this is really an ideal time to review the content that you've got. What do we need to keep? What do we need to archive? What do we need to migrate? And we've got some tooling we've created as well as the vendors that help with that process. Okay, so high level, what does this process look like? Starting at the top, we actually like to start with the inventory. We don't actually go straight to the information architecture because often we'll see things in the patterns that you've worked in the past, for better or for worse, that'll influence what that information architecture should look like. How have you organized? Is it very cross-functional where there's project sites that span different departments, or it's very siloed within the departments? We're not going to try and reorg your business as part of this exercise. We want to understand how you work today, how you're likely to work tomorrow, and that becomes a big input into the information architecture discussion. So we plan out that IEA in collaboration with you, and then we get into the actual migration process itself and a number of ways that that's going to happen. And the launch out from there, and then adoption and change management, as I mentioned, big part of the success of this as well through there. So let's start with the inventory process. And these are things that we've created ourselves. I've blogged about this in the past. We've open sourced some of this stuff up there. We don't have our latest scripts and latest tools published out in there. If enough folks from the webinar drop emails back to Logan to say, hey, I'm really interested in getting more up to date from that, yeah, we're happy to pull that together and get that published out to GitHub so you've got access to it. But the basic idea is that, we've really looked at SharePoint on-premise as the source here, but this could equally be your file shares or your other document management systems. And we're leveraging PowerShell scripts to inventory that content, to basically say, hey, what are all the documents and what's all the metadata that we can capture about the documents to prepare an inventory. And often that metadata, if it's a file share, is pretty limited. We can see file names, we can see the path it's in, we can see when that document was created, when it was last modified. That's actually really important metadata when you're starting to look through and say, hey, do we keep this, delete this, archive this? What do we do? Is it something that nobody's touched in the last 10 years? Or maybe it needs to be archived, or maybe it's a record that, from a retention point of view, really should be disposed of. There's a legal liability of actually keeping that around still. So, this is a good opportunity through this inventory process to do that. We basically run these PowerShell scripts against your source systems, dump that into comma separated value CSV Excel files, and then we bring it into Microsoft Power BI. Power BI is a great tool to be able to mash those large numbers of information together and provide some visualizations so you can start to make some decisions on that. And then we actually have another Excel that we start to record those decisions. We can actually feed that back into the Power BI as those decisions are being made. So you can say, hey, do we have coverage? Have we made a decision on all the content that we have in our source system? We've marked it all either as delete, archive, or migrate. And do we have the right paths to migrate to as part of that? So this becomes an iterative process as you're going through there, making those decisions, recording them, and sort of tracking your progress to say, hey, do we have a full and complete plan together on this? Now, there's some other things that need to go on as part of that from a pre-upgrade assessment point of view. This is a paid engagement. We're happy to chat with you, Logan, give you some more details if you'd like to engage us from this point of view. The inventory is obviously part of that, but particularly when we're talking about on-premises SharePoint, there may often be lots of custom or vendor solutions deployed to your SharePoint. And those are often a barrier to migration. So, we've got to figure out what the best upgrade approach is through that. So, we'll deliver out that inventory of your content, the Power BI analysis, and actually I'm going to show you how we share that out in a cool new way in our customer portals, and give you some sense of what's the approach, the estimated costs if we were to do the migration, or to support you through that, timelines and such around that.
Hey Peter, just on that topic, I think one item that does come up, we see these in these migration projects, is using older forms and workflows, and how we would, because that kind of becomes part of this pre-upgrade assessment too, is to look at, if you want to speak a bit to our approach there.
Sure. Actually, this next slide is good around that. So this migration collaboration triangle slide, I think it actually came from Microsoft initially. I mean, it's looking at your on-premise SharePoint online, hybrid Azure, however you've got the structure running today, and what's the complexity of the solutions that you've got deployed there. If it's just folders and files and you've got some security and some metadata on that, that's super easy to bring across. So the effort is quite low to rehost that onto SharePoint Online. As we start to get into workflows, as Logan mentioned, this is a common scenario that we see. We've got SharePoint Designer 2010 or 2013 workflows running. Those are no longer supported in SharePoint Online. Those really need to go through a transformation. And typically for us, that means either Power Automate workflows or Logic App workflows, both of which are Microsoft technologies. I give a talk on pros and cons around that if you look back in our event history around that. So it's really about looking at those solutions and saying, hey, how do we transform that to use modern cloud workflow tools for that? So that's sort of a medium effort. As we get into custom user experience or custom code, there's things like server solutions where you've actually written code that runs on the SharePoint server on premises. And because that's your server, you're allowed to do that. That's fine. Microsoft's actually been pushing people away from that for quite a long time, probably 8-10 years. It's had different strategies to try and eliminate that. And the reason they were pushing that, obviously, is when you get into the cloud, you're in a multi-tenant environment. Your SharePoint is shared with everybody else in that farm, which could be thousands of other organizations, and they're never going to let you run your code on those servers. So you really need to figure out how to replace, remove, or rewrite those solutions. And honestly, effort can become very high through there. And this is part of what we do in our consulting engagements, is to look at these and say, hey, what's going to be involved in this? And we've done a number of migrations in the last year where we had clients running on either SharePoint 2010 or 2013 who are coming end of life, and they're like, we need to get this into a supported state. And for one of them, we spent quite a few months going through hundreds of workflow solutions that they had and helping them rebuild them as Power Automate solutions. So they went through the transform exercise. Whereas another client had not just custom workflows, they had InfoPath forms, they had a bunch of custom code behind that. And like it or not, we ended up helping migrate them to SharePoint 2019. And they absolutely know they need to get off the on-premise server and into the cloud. It's just they didn't have the luxury of time. It was going to be more than a year's effort of basically removing or rewriting those applications in the cloud first strategy. And they're like, look, let's just get to 2019 so we're supported, and then we can take a pause and look at tackling those solutions and removing them, because we're already a Microsoft 365 customer. It's crazy that we're still running on-premises server. We need to move off of that. These can turn into multi-year projects depending on the complexity. You may say, hey, let's take the easy stuff and get that into SharePoint Online, but we've still got 1, 2, 3 applications that are very complex and mission critical. We can't just eliminate them and remove them. We have to figure out how to rewrite them, and that's going to take some time. So we're quite well versed around those sorts of challenges. So from a planning point of view, we're going to generate reports. We're going to pull things like custom solutions that are deployed to the farm, workflows and InfoPath forms and things like that, and help you decide how we're going to mitigate those issues. And the next big thing, really, from a planning point of view, is what is the appropriate migration tool? I mentioned there's a few, and we'll get to that in just a second. Those tools can provide a number of valuable reports, so they can become part of that planning and inventory process as well. And then typically we encourage doing a migration proof of concept to say, hey, let's try this out. Let's get an understanding of things like throughput. How long is it going to take to do the migration? So we can get a migration timeline together. And then often we help out with the migration itself. Very rarely do we run the entire migration ourselves. Typically, we're there in a support role or helping out role, but the client is very engaged because there's a lot of decisions that need to be made. Not just through that planning process, but all the way through of what are you keeping, what are you deleting, what are you archiving, and the business needs to be very close to that and part of those decisions. So on the tools side, starting on the left, from a simple point of view, these are the free tools provided by Microsoft. Super simple using the OneDrive Sync client, and there's actually some really good scenarios where that makes a lot of sense that I'll talk about. And there's also a free SharePoint migration tool that can be used. As you come into the middle here, we've been a big fan of ShareGate for years. They've got a fantastic tool. We've done a lot of migrations with them. Their big thing is just making migrations easy. Their tool is simple to use, and it's really targeted to the end business customer. It's not a technical person that needs to use that tool. And then Zelio, we've only been recently working with over the last year or so, and they're about the tough solutions. There's a very complex migration. It's not just SharePoint on-premises or file shares. It's old legacy Documentum, OpenText, Content Manager from IBM solutions that need to migrate. There's a lot more complexity involved in there. And this is very much more of a developer-focused tool, so it is a more technical-led migration as part of that. But let's start on the simple end of the scale and using the OneDrive Sync client. So you may or may not use this today yourself now. I use it all the time. I'm actually doing the webinar live. It's 9:30 p.m. here because I'm doing a working vacation for Mauritius, which is off the coast of Africa. So OneDrive is important to me. I've got all my files synced through there. You can actually use it as a migration tool though as well. You can say, hey, we've got these new SharePoint Online team sites that we've created through our fancy new governance and provisioning solution that we've deployed. And maybe we've got a bunch of file shares that we need to migrate the content across. What you can do is sync those new libraries in SharePoint Online and then literally just copy those sites and folders into the new environment on your local machine and let the sync client go. I wouldn't do it from the other side of the world when your sync client's not super fast like it isn't for me. But have yourself close on a decent internet connection and you can actually migrate a large amount of content very quickly through that. And the nice thing is one of the most important piece of metadata on file share content is the modified date. You don't want to lose that. You don't want to migrate everything across and have it all show up as the date that you migrated, which is exactly what would happen if you were to just grab those folders and drag them, drop into the browser. SharePoint Online will say, oh, these are all new files. They've got today's date on them. It becomes super hard to figure out what's what. And when you've got duplicate files, which you inevitably do, Out of file shares, you'll never unwind that. So the OneDrive Sync Client is a nice solution for those sort of simple scenarios. You could even use it SharePoint to SharePoint as well. You can sync, on the source side and on the target side, and drag and drop through there from that point of view. It won't bring all your other metadata across as part of that. So it's not ideal as you get into richer SharePoint to SharePoint migrations, but for file share works really well. SharePoint migration tool, this is the free tool. It's been out for a couple of years from now from Microsoft, but they've added and improved to it. Honestly, we've never used it. We've tried a few times and we've run into issues, challenges. It just hasn't been solid enough for us, and we've ended up back at ShareGate. ShareGate is not free. There's costs associated with that, but it's not horribly expensive either. So it just makes sense to use that tool. So unfortunately, I can't strongly encourage the SharePoint migration tool. Other folks may have had different experience and success with it. I don't really push it as a big solution from that point of view. And then if we move into ShareGate, so ShareGate's been around for, I guess, 13 years now. Started actually as a consulting company, much like Envision IT in Montreal. Knew the folks there well, the great folks to work with, and ShareGate was their software product, and it's just exploded. They were, I think, 20 employees when I knew them back in the day, and they're now 250 plus employees. 75,000 IT pros using their tool, so they've become very dominant in the marketplace from that point of view. And the thing to remember with ShareGate, it's not just a migration tool, it is an all-up Microsoft 365 governance tool. It deals with a lot of the same things that Orchestra deals with in terms of, how do we identify teams that are orphaned, that people aren't using anymore, and how do we clean that up? So there's actually some good governance tools as part of ShareGate as well, but how we know it best is from a migration point of view. And they do have some rich reporting in the tool itself that actually helps with the inventory and the planning point of view. We can pull out things like site collection reports on used sites to figure out whether we're keeping or deleting those, orphaned users. There's lots of different reports you can use as part of your planning process as you're going through your migration. So we can go through that analysis and pull those details out. Now, honestly, we tend to still use our own Power BI approach and then feed that into ShareGate. We find that we get a little more granularity and a little richness out from that point of view, but there's a lot there out of the box as part of ShareGate as well. And you can get into the permissions matrix and understand who has access to what as part of that, because often permissions get broken and get quite convoluted, both in file shares and in on-premises SharePoint. This is actually a good time now to maybe clean some of that up. I'm not a big fan of having broken permissions in a lot of different places. I'd rather see your information architecture built in a way that you don't need to do that. But again, it's still something that's important as you're planning for your migration. This is a big one actually as well. We don't have a script for it. ShareGate has a great tool just to find documents that are checked out, because they're a big gotcha when you're doing a migration, that if people have a bunch of documents checked out, when you've logged and said, hey, we're about to make the old site read-only and start the migration for real the last time, we're not going to get those files that are checked out. So it's important to identify those and deal with those before you start the final migration as part of that. So that's on the ShareGate side of the house. Let's switch over to Zelio. Zelio has actually been around a little longer than ShareGate, going back all the way to 2004. SharePoint was in its infancy back then. I'm not actually sure with Zelio working on different styles of migrations. But again, just like Envision IT, just like ShareGate, they started as a consulting organization. They built some in-house migration software, and now their focus is strictly on building that software and helping clients do those migrations. They've got lots of different migration connectors. So if you've got some crazy old legacy records management solution, they either have a connector already for it, or they could probably create one as part of that. Certainly smaller numbers than ShareGate in terms of numbers of clients, but these are really tough, complex migrations. We did a big one for a financial services records management, millions and millions of documents, lots of complexity out of an old legacy IBM Content Manager system. We didn't know Zelio then. This was going back about 2 years. I wish I had, because it would have made that job a whole lot easier. We used ShareGate for it, but we had to do so much custom stuff in front of ShareGate because ShareGate didn't understand that legacy system. It's not their market space to do that. It is Zelio, so they're great from that point of view. And I know a bunch of the MVPs through the community, so great folks on that side. So, their mission is really helping organizations to move from legacy systems, which may be lots of different types of systems, into modern content services in M365. So what actually appealed to me when I looked at their architecture, it's basically what we built, where we had these extraction and inventory tools that would bring into a Power BI data model. It's just they've done it at a whole level higher than what we've created in our tooling. So once I saw this, I'm like, oh, this is really cool. We've got this unified data model that can take all this disparate system data that could be file shares, it could be different versions of SharePoint on premises, they could be old legacy records management system, pull all that content together. They do deduplication and all sorts of cool stuff around that inside their unified data model, and then build out the targets and push the content out as part of that. So they've got a really nice solution from that perspective. Key differentiators for them, they're the tough migrations. So you've got these legacy enterprise content management systems you need to get off of. They're a great tool to do that. They've got lots of data visualizations and insights, so you can build out those rules, handle all the exceptions. I'm a big fan of their unified data model. That architecture makes a lot of sense to me. They got lots of years of experience and strong experience on that side. Okay. But regardless of which tool you choose to use, whether you use out-of-the-box free Microsoft tooling, you use ShareGate, you use Zelio, there's actually quite a number of others, Migration Wiz, AvePoint. I don't know those ones myself that well, so that's why I'm not talking about them. But there are other players in the market as well. But the process is still going to be the same. You're going to do some inventory and planning of what you've got, decide how that's going to get migrated across. This one's important. This is coming back to the governance and provisioning side of things. Use those tools, get them in place, get a proper governance structure, and use it to build out your target teams and sites as part of that. Do your migration mapping to say, hey, we inventoried this. We've got this new information architecture here. How do we map between those? That's what this migration mapping is all about. Use the tool of your choice to do the actual migration. Test. You're not going to do this migration once. You're going to do it multiple times. So you'll do proof of concepts, you'll do test migrations, you'll get users involved in user acceptance testing, and then you'll do the actual for real migration and launch and adoption training. And you may do this multiple times. We'll talk about different approaches where you may not do everything in one fell swoop, either because timing doesn't allow you. There's just too much to migrate, or it's just too much change to the organization, and you need to stagger that out across different departments or teams or what have you through there. So talking about the time side of things, I mean, typically what we see with ShareGate is about 1 to 2 gigabyte per hour from a throughput point of view. So what that means is if you've got 2 terabytes of content that you need to migrate, there's 1,000 gigabytes in every terabyte. At 1.5 gig an hour, it's going to take 55 days to do that migration. Now, don't get freaked about that if you do have 2+ terabytes of content. There's things we can do there. We can say, hey, we can buy a bunch of licenses. It's actually not that much more expensive to buy a 5-pack of ShareGate license or a 15-pack, run it across multiple machines and run that in parallel. So we could run that across 15 virtual machines. Say instead of 55 days, we can get that done in 3 to 4 days. It's still not a weekend. A lot of these migrations happen over weekends where everything gets prepared, and then Friday end of business, you say to the business, okay, everything's locked, you can't touch anything, it's all read-only, we're going to start the migration, we do most of the work through Saturday, business is going to come in on Sunday and check everything, give a go, no go, and then Monday morning it's business as usual on the new system from there. So you kind of want to figure out what can we fit in over a weekend. Now, one of the things you can do is actually pre-migrate a bunch of the content. Typically people aren't changing everything every day. There's a very small portion of the content that actually changes on a regular basis. So maybe you can pre-migrate 90% of that content and then do a last little 10% incremental on the weekend and bring that time significantly down. Now, Zelio, we don't have as much direct experience in. They claim to be able to get much higher throughputs than the 1-2 gig per hour. So, obviously they're a more complex, more sophisticated tool. They can do more from that point of view. It is important, regardless of which tool you're using, to make sure that you're either close to the source, like if you're running a private data center and you've got all your file shares and on-premise SharePoint servers in that data center, then you might want to put the virtual machines in that data center as well. Or maybe you want to put them in the Azure data center, but choose the same region that your Microsoft 365 is going into. You don't want things going across long distances, because when you're doing big migrations like this, it actually does make a difference. The speed of light is finite and actually has an impact from this point of view. And other thing to bear in mind is the content size and the metadata complexity can really affect the throughput. If you've got a bunch of video files that are 2 gigabytes each and all they have is the last modified date, that's actually really easy to migrate, because it's just crunching through a tremendous amount of data, but you're not worrying about versions, you're not worrying about rich metadata. Whereas if you've got a whole whack of tiny little files that each have a lot of metadata on them, that's actually a lot of work for the migration tool to migrate, and you'll see that throughput go down significantly as a result of that. So this is why it's so important to test and to get a sense of what your throughput's going to be and make that part of your planning exercise. So really, our two main approaches are doing a full migration. Say, hey, we're just going to cold turkey, cut everything over a weekend. We'll do all the testing and pre-migration, and then come 5 p.m. on the Friday of the migration weekend for real, everybody's signed off on the testing, we're good to go. All those source systems become read-only. The file shares can't be changed. The SharePoint on-premises servers can't be changed. You can still read data from them. You just can't update anything, because we don't want people changing things in the middle of us doing the migration. And we've done that pre-migration, so a lot of that has already gone through. But tools like Zelio and ShareGate are really good at doing incrementals to say, hey, you don't have to identify ahead of time what's changed and what hasn't. The tools will do that for you, and they'll figure out, oh, these things have changed, these ones haven't. I'll just migrate what needs to through there. You should have done a lot of testing, prior, but then there's the weekend of testing. Typically Sunday afternoon sometime there's a go, no go call to say, hey, is everything ready to go here? Yep, flip the switch, make it live, and Monday morning everything's good to go from there. The multiple migration is really the same approach. It's just carving off smaller pieces. Say, hey, we can't do all of that at one time. There's too much change. There's too much stuff to migrate. So let's identify departments, projects, regions, whatever makes sense for your organization, and do that over multiple weekends. There's obviously more change management in there, particularly because you're going to be running old and new systems, and people will often get confused and say, oh, this project is in SharePoint Online, but this project is still in SharePoint on-premises. How do I get from one to the other? We've done things around navigation in both the old and the new systems to make it easier. But there's opportunity for confusion there. So our preference is to do a full migration if we can. It's not always possible. So this leads me into the change management and adoption side of things. Actually, you know what? I'm going to pause here for a second. I've been going gangbusters here on slide decks, and I had some cool demos that I wanted to show people. So let me take a couple minutes, because I know we're getting close to the 3/4 of the way mark through here, and flip gears over into that. Okay, so I've got a couple of different things going on here. Let me just get my Windows set up on my other screen here. Bear with me one sec. So I want to talk about the scripts first. So let me just bring this window across. I'm not going to get into the PowerShell script itself. It gets a little bit too detailed. We've got a number of different scripts here that we would run on your system. So typically, we would need your system administrator to run these for us and then give us the results back. So we've got one that targets file shares. So you give it a list of file shares that you've got in your environment, and it'll just crawl all the way down as deep as those folders within folders you have, which can be 10, 20 levels deep in some organizations, and pull all the metadata about all the documents that are in there. What are the file names? What are the types of documents? When were they created, modified, file size, all that kind of data, and dump that out into a big CSV that we can feed into a Power BI report. The SharePoint 2010 pair here do the same sort of thing. They go through all the documents in a SharePoint 2010. In fact, I think we use these same scripts on 2013 farms as well. So that gets the document level, and this gets all the site collections and subsites information. And then this one here is for the inventory one we actually use for newer SharePoint, like SharePoint 2016 and 2019, as well as SharePoint Online. So depending on where you're coming from, we've got a couple different scripts that we can use through here. We don't do what Zelio does. We don't have the richer unified data model and the ability to pull from lots of different sources, but this covers most of the bases from that point of view. And then what we can do, if I come over to this folder here, this is just a quick demo sample that we've done against a small file share data set that we have. So this is the output of running that file share script. So we've got one row in the CSV for each document that we found in that file share. We've got a list of site collections, which is a bit of a misnomer. We actually use it to denote different file shares as well when we're doing our planning process. It's just we started building this first with SharePoint Online and then expanded it to 2 file shares. And then this is an important one. This is where we actually start to make decisions. So let me pop this one open in Excel. Now this particular scenario that I'm taking you through here is quite simple. There's not a whole lot involved in it. And I've got basically 3 folders in a demo documents file share structure here. And I'm making different decisions on each of those folders. And these decisions could be at that folder level, they could be at a subfolder level, they could be on an individual document level. Really what we're doing is working with the business to fill this spreadsheet out to say, let's go through everything that you have to migrate at as high a level as possible, so you don't have to make the decision a million times for a million documents, and decide what you want to do with that, what action you're going to take on that. We also use this to track the owners, to say, hey, who's the business owner of this that we need to go to build those decisions out. And if we're doing a teams first migration, even if maybe these teams and channels don't exist yet, but we know that they likely will be there in the future, what's our target there? And we actually have a teams tab and a channels tab here that we can use to map this out, so that as we're making decisions here, I can simply just pick what team and channel that's going to go to and have it target out from there. So the migrate one is going into engineering general, the archive is going to an archive general, and the ignore we can leave blank because we're not doing anything with that one. Now, typically this comes as a result of looking at things in the Power BI. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So again, this is a very simple example. There's not a lot of documents in here. We've got a total of 375 documents in this file share, so it's pretty tiny from a migration point of view. There's only about 60 meg versus of content in there. And as I mentioned, we've got those 3 different subpaths within the file shares that we're making decisions on. So what I showed you in that Excel, we can see in here, but we can also see, since this is Power BI, if I want to click on that ignore to say, what are we ignoring? Well, we're ignoring some files from back in 2010 and 2012 primarily. There's a couple of outliers in other years in there, and what was the size of that content and what were these? Well, they were all JPEG image files. So, as we're exploring through here, even before we start to make these decisions, we can use this to filter down and understand what's at those different levels. That archive at the icons level is all a bunch of PNGs from back at 2010 and 2015. These are all old sample docs, so they're going back fairly far in time. Although we do show on here, what was the latest modified. Something in there was modified in 2020, which is a little more recently than these ones back here. So I can see that trending there. This one actually has a bunch of different stuff. There's PDFs, there's Word docs, there's Excel files in there, Microsoft projects, PowerPoints, text files, zip files. I can see how that breaks down and what sort of content is in there. As you get bigger data sets in here, this becomes even more valuable. You can start to look at both the high level and a lower level through there. So if I want to drill down into this, I can say, hey, let's drill through this into a file summary and get an understanding, just a bigger picture so I can see more easily. Hey, we've got 6 meg worth of files, 45 files. They map over, these years, these numbers, these types of extensions through there. And I can come back. That same sort of drill through. So I want to come down into the files tree. I want to explore and see what that looks like. Now we've got a pretty deep path before we even get into the file share. So these first kind of couple of levels through here don't actually make a whole lot of sense. But if I come down into the docs level, Actually, I think I picked one that doesn't have anything beyond that. Here, let me go back because it'll make more sense on the images one. So if I drill through that one into the files tree, if I click on the images, I can at least see one more level beyond that and see the folder structure in here. But if I had a really deep folder structure, I can start drilling deeper into that, and then I can do drill throughs from here to understand the files within that particular folder and really explore my content and ultimately be able to start populating this Excel with my decisions and planning out what my migration is going to look like. If I come back here and I go back to my main original tab, I can add some filters in here to say, hey, I want to get ones where I don't have a decision yet on it, and just drill into those and say, hey, that's what I want to focus on. Ignore what I've already decided what I'm doing with, and go from there. Now, clients, obviously want to see this because they're very much part of this. And one of the challenges we had in the past is that we can publish this up into a Power BI workspace. We can share that externally with them as a guest account. But unfortunately, if they don't have a Power BI license themselves, they can't actually see it. It's not like SharePoint when you share something externally, there's no licensing required for those external users. There is for Power BI. So we actually just launching a new product as part of our external user manager that allows people to share that in a way that you don't need a user license. It's using what's called a Power BI embedded service. So this is a pay-per-use on consumption. Doesn't matter how many people are using it. It's how much CPU, how much memory is the Power BI using. That's what you pay for by the hour. So if I flip over here for a second into our portal product, this is part of our external user manager product. I'm not going to get too deep into that right now, but let me log in with this account here, which is one of dev test accounts here, and pretend that I'm coming into this portal.envisionit.com, which is our customer portal, as that user. And this particular user, I've made them a member of a group, which is the demo Power BI for that document inventory analysis I was just showing. So I can click this view group here. Excuse me. It may take a few seconds here because what we're doing is we're saying, hey, is anybody looking at reports right now? Is the Power BI service running? No. Okay, start it up. So it took about 5-10 seconds for the service to start up. And now that user can see those reports. And once the last person stops looking at reports, we let it run for an hour or so. And then we say, hey, shut that service down. So you pay about $1 USD per hour to run the service. So if people are looking at reports, for 100 hours a month, you pay $100 for that, which is actually quite cost effective. And all those same things that I was showing you with the drill through, and the filtering, be able to cross filter across all these different things and understand the relationships between them. All of that exists in through here as well. We can see those different tabs. We've got all that functionality through there. We can set up filters. We can do all the same things, and I don't need a Power BI license as a client coming in to be able to see that. So that was on the demo side of things. I wanted to show you that. And if you want to know more about those scripts, you'd like to get your hands on some of this stuff, by all means, reach out to Logan. Let's chat more about that. We've open sourced it in the past. I'm very open to doing more of that as well. Or we can do a proof of concept with you and work with you on that side. So I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here. The last piece, can't stress enough, the change management and adoption. You are going to be inflicting a large amount of change on your organization by doing this. You're going to have folks that are been used to for years or maybe decades working a certain way with folders and file shares, and suddenly you're asking them to work in a completely new way in the cloud. And there's things that you can do to mitigate that. You can say, hey, let's get the OneDrive for business sync client set up so people can sync all their folders onto their local system, and it kind of feels like a file share with Windows Explorer, so it doesn't feel as big of a change for them. But there's still going to be things different. This idea of version history in the cloud and co-authoring and all these cool things from a modern workplace point of view. You want to make people aware of that because people are naturally going to resist change. You need to show them the carrots and say, hey, I know this is a different way of working, but this is why it's better. It's actually really good. We're going to be more productive. I needed to buy into this. And it's across the organization. It's got all the way up to the top as well. You got to get your senior leadership team on board and have them promote and show by example through the organization as part of that. Focus on department successes, find your champions in there, really leverage that and push that as part of that. Get the pilots going, and get subject matter expertise going within your organization and really drive for success. It's not an overnight journey. This is about planning out a 6-month, year-long, multi-year-long roadmap of what this transition means for your organization, and that's okay. You don't want to rush change. You don't want to throw too much at people too quickly. And training obviously is a big part of that as well. So get your training plan together. We provide some end user content around training. We provide knowledge transfer. So we've got a number of different options that we can provide there. Whether it's setting up some official Microsoft curriculum and third parties, because we're not a formal technical trainer per se, but we do a lot of end user sessions with our clients, and we do a ton of knowledge transfer sessions, both for technical folks and for business users. They can be very ad hoc, they can be custom. We really like to use your configuration as part of that and use your business scenarios. They just resonate so much better, and people get a much better understanding out from that. And we help you build custom training guides, do lunch and learns, quick reference cards. There's lots of things you can do to build on that and really make it successful for your organization. One of the things we encourage clients to do is actually deploy what's called learning pathways. So this is actually a collection of online training videos that Microsoft has created. They make it freely available. It's not just for Teams. It covers much of Microsoft 365, and it's very customizable. So you can actually take out the pieces that aren't relevant. You can add in your own custom content to that, and basically you've got sort of a light learning management solution right in Microsoft 365. There's a number of third-party products that go much further than this. Visual SP is their claim to fame is around in-context learning. So having training and learning that comes up while you're actually doing the task is pretty cool. LMS 365 is a partner of ours that has a whole learning management solution built on top of Microsoft 365. You can use it to train people on M365. You can use it very broadly to say, hey, we have training and certifications in our industry. We can use that as part of that through there as well. So there is lots of rich content in there. I encourage you to explore that. And part of change management is just being aware of how people are adapting to that change. So doing things like going into Microsoft 365 Analytics and saying, hey, how are we doing from a communication, collaboration, mobility point of view? There's a lot of reports in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center that will help you understand how are you trending, how are you improving, is your change management working well? So understanding the reports that come through there and what you can do from that point of view. And another partner of ours is tyGraph. They have a whole solution that takes that to a whole nother level to say, hey, let's harvest all of the usage data from all the different tools in Microsoft 365 and start to build out some really deep analytics so you can understand how different parts of your organization are working, where they're effective, where do you need to target your training dollars, your change management and such as part of that. Their target is this idea of actionable analytics for Microsoft 365. So not just here's a whole bunch of analytics, but what do they mean? And what should you do as an organization as a result of the learnings that those analytics give you? Okay, down to 2 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap things up here. So if you are still on premises, even if you're 2016, 2019, the clock is ticking. It's really time to move into the cloud. There's just so much more value there from that point of view. So figure out a roadmap. Happy to work with you to plan that out. Maybe get some prototypes, proof of concepts going from there. And remember that migration time is a good time for some house cleaning too. Do that planning, figure out, from a retention point of view, what should we get rid of? What should we archive? How do we tidy up some of this mess? Tools like Zelio even take that to another level of identifying, hey, we've got 6 copies of the same Excel. This is the right one. Let's get rid of the rest of them. Doing that kind of house cleaning as well. Can't stress enough, think about Teams. You may not be fully using it within your organization yet, but you're likely trending that way. So make sure you take that into consideration when you're building out your information architecture. And also figure out a governance. You want consistency around how your sites, your teams, your templates are created through there, and the change management to go along with all that. Last but not least, a couple sessions coming up. If you were interested in what I was showing you with that Power BI embedded to look at the reports inside of a portal, and eliminate the user licensing side. I'm actually giving a talk March 22nd on that topic, so tune in on that side. And then if you happen to be down in Las Vegas, I'm actually doing a session on external users, unstructured and structured in Teams and Microsoft 365 in Las Vegas at the M365 conference. So we got a couple questions as we went through there. Logan, we literally got about a minute left here. I don't know if there's something top of mind that we want to tackle as a group, and then beyond that, we can certainly follow up on other questions.
I think for the most part, Peter, it's been more of a collaborative conversation back and forth, which has been great to see that sort of engagement from everyone on the call. So no, I think we're in pretty good shape.
Cool. Well, with that, I will bid you all adieu. Thanks for tuning in. Hope it was a good session. And by all means, reach out if you'd like to learn more. Thanks, everybody.